has been alleged for several years now that JFK Jr. is still alive, and that his death in a small aircraft accident was a runaround for an assassination attempt in order to get the assassin's contractor, the Hildebeest, to believe that the hit succeeded and keep him out of danger, presumably in Witsec, while the evidence was gathered to take down those responsible for the November 22, 1963 coup d'etat. As tinfoil hat as that might seem, when you examine the outpoints of the story and the mountains of evidence and archived footage, the possibility that what is being alleged is true not only appears stronger, but it fits the pattern of facts so perfectly that it is squarely on the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. I, my late friend Art Bernklau, a U.S. Marine sniper with over 200 confirmed kills in his 13 years in Vietnam, and Stoney Stone, who has done yeoman's work on this subject, using archived VHS and TiVo files that his late father collected, leads me, and will lead any reasonable person who watches what is linked in the description section, to the same inescapable logical conclusion. JFK Jr., the little boy photographed saluting the casket of his murdered father, grew up knowing the truth, and has ever since been plotting revenge and planning how to bring down righteous judgment on those who took his father from him, and on the entire elitist cabal of scumbags who literally stole the USA from the people. If we are right, this country and the world are at the edge of the most awesome time in human history. The final defeat of those forces that seek to destroy humanity and the demise of the 3,500-year-old tyranny of Cain and Satan is about to unfold. We are about to witness the revelation of biblical prophecy, as I like to call it, the history of the future come true. The following are clips of news coverage of the night of the JFK Jr. plane crash. It is taken from Stoney Stone's archives. There are 2 other videos, as of this post, that are linked in the description. If you're into the JFK story, these add a new dimension to the saga that clears up a bit of the mystery.
I sure do appreciate everybody for being here, and I hope you guys enjoy this. It might be my last video on here, so doesn't matter. I'm going to put it out anyway. Here we go. God bless. Talk to you guys soon. Hopefully you guys catch something in here, like maybe the lies that's been spread about this whole situation. Hopefully you enjoy it. Here we go. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys real soon. God bless.
All morning long you've heard various reports that a beacon was picked up off the North Fork of Long Island. NBC veteran aviation correspondent Robert Hager in Washington Bureau would perhaps more on that. Bob?
I think the sense we're getting now is that that beacon indeed was picked up early this morning, but that subsequent investigation of it, it turned out that it was not a beacon from a downed plane, and so that is no longer in effect a hot lead. Meantime, there is some new information that would put this plane much closer to the approach to Martha's Vineyard. There are a couple of different sort of fragmentary reports now coming from the Coast Guard, one of which says that the radar of this plane was last seen at 9:39 p.m. And that was just miles west of Martha's Vineyard. 9:39 p.m. would make it about an hour into its flight, so that timing works out about right. There is another report also from the Coast Guard that the plane made its contact with the Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9:39. So I was mistaken in that first reporting. It's that the first report from the Coast Guard is that a blip was last seen just miles west of Martha's Vineyard. A second separate report is that the plane was last heard from at 9:39 p.m. and the timing of that would suggest that it was up in the Martha's Vineyard area. Now, as Bob Arnott pointed out, Actually, for a plane, the various things that can go wrong, this would make a lot more sense for something to have occurred when you're up into that approach area. It's just that in level flight and at midpoints, such as the plane would have been over the tip of Long Island, there are a lot fewer things that can potentially go wrong. As you enter the approach regime, there are many, many things that can go wrong, and
they'll pick up that sound.
You're looking, we just want to describe to our audience, the images there are coming from WNYW. It's off the coast of Long Island, New York. That is just one area where the search is conducted. It stretches up the coast of Long Island there up to Massachusetts. And as you can see in that particular area, the sea state does appear to be very good. As they try to find this aircraft, Michael, the ELT, we've spoken about it before. This is a device that can go off apparently accidentally, but it is designed to go off in the event of a disaster with the aircraft. Is that right?
Right. The Piper is also equipped with transponders used for navigation that communicate with the ground. And in dense airspace, they have to have that on board, but that shouldn't be confused, with the emergency locator, which is only designed to go off upon some degree of impact. I'm not sure what that is, so that it doesn't send a false signal. But let's assume this is a well-working one, and it is going off, and hopefully it'll lead the rescuers.
We mentioned the Civil Air Patrol. Tell us a bit about who they are and how important they are in a search of this nature.
Well, once again, there's no rules here. This is ad hoc. You cobble together all of your resources, and without regard to necessarily to lines of authority here. So you have the Air Force, probably you have the Coast Guard, the Air Force, Civil Air Patrol, voluntary air people from New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. I mean, everybody who can have
this vineyard. And in fact, we know that John F. Kennedy Jr. flew up frequently for weekend trips in Martha's Vineyard in that plane that he took lessons and learned how to fly in 1997. He was equipped to fly visual flight rules, which is sort of the first initial stage. They were flying last night with on that single engine plane up to Martha's Vineyard with either 3 or 4 people on board. There are conflicting reports, but ABC News sources and Associated Press sources say that John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and possibly her sister were all on board that plane when it took off shortly after 8:30 last night. Barbara, given this is a couple, John and Carolyn, who has gone through quite a bit in the last few years, and yet, according to all people, they've really sort of weathered things well. I mean, in the last several months in particular, they have really sort of come into their own and seem to grow more comfortable with the scrutiny that had been plaguing them for so long.
I think the press began to a degree, lay off in part because John Kennedy Jr. got married. You know, all of those years before he was married, he was such a stunning young man, and the press
He still is.
Well, he still is, but then when he was single, I mean, he was as good. He is as good looking as any movie star. As a matter of fact, there was a moment or two when people thought that he might be an actor. And he was asked about whether or not he wanted to be an actor, and it was something that he rejected, and it certainly didn't seem to be something that his mother would have loved. But now that they have been married for a few years, and he has proven himself to be a really very good publisher and quite a good reporter, and the magazine has hung in there and developed its own readership. And he's now in his 30s, and people began to take him more seriously, and there wasn't the same kind of intense press coverage. You know, the Kennedys always had two feelings about the press, as most people in the public eye do. John Kennedy, at one hand, President Kennedy loved the press, yet if the press wrote something bad about him, there were newspapers that he discontinued in the White House. Jacqueline Kennedy, I can't say that she had a love-hate relationship. I think she had just a straight dislike. She never did an interview, never really did, Elizabeth, unless she was commenting on a charity that meant something to her, and even then a landmark, for example. She talked when there was talk about tearing down Grand Central Station.
Right.
But she never sat down for an interview. She never answered the press back. I mean, when you think of the kind of things that had been written about her, and she never answered it back. She took it. She smiled. Whenever you saw her publicly, she had a kind of glassy eye and pasted-on smile. but she did it. And her son learned from that. And he didn't answer the press back. You don't hear him saying, I didn't say that, and we didn't do that, and my wife and I. They just went about their business, both of them. Caroline Bessette learned to live with it. She did not complain to her husband about it. She took it. She never herself gave an interview. She never answered the press. On the other hand, they never reacted. They never got mad.
Absolutely.
They never tore, they never hit a camera person or tore a piece of film away.
And interesting, Barbara, what Richard Reeves, the Kennedy biographer, just said recently, that he didn't find it so unusual that John Kennedy Jr. would go into journalism, because that was also a love of his father's. Very quickly, I just want to report here that ABC News has learned that the Kennedy family at the compound is planning to hold a mass at the compound, praying for the survival of John Kennedy Jr. and his wife, Caroline, and Caroline's sister, Lauren. The Kennedy family now has a long tradition of holding masses at the compound. When Rose Kennedy was alive, masses were celebrated daily there. Obviously, the family is assembled there for the wedding of Rory Kennedy, which we are told has now been postponed indefinitely. So the family and many of the guests, we're told as many as 275 people already assembled at Hyannisport are gathered there to say a mass, to pray for the safety of John Kennedy Jr. and Caroline. Lisa Stark is in Washington. Lisa, what can you tell me about this? Well, first of all, we spoke a few minutes ago about the fact that this emergency beacon miles west of Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
I don't know if you're near a map or if you have, but is that
in the Martha's Vineyard area, searching for the beacon noise, but searching at random. There's no specific place to go to know that you might be more apt to pick it up there than somewhere else.
Bob Hager, thank you. Bob Arnott, who is a pilot frequently on this air route as recently as last night. Bob, let's say you're one of the many pilots coming up the New York to Martha's Vineyard air corridor. What do you do when, say, you're within visual sight of the island?
First, when you're probably about 30 miles away, you're going to call what's called Cape Approach on frequency 124.70. They'll then pass you over to the Martha's Vineyard Tower, which is a frequency of 121.4.
Is it manned 24 hours a day?
These towers tend to close about 10 o'clock at night, these island towers. It's not like LaGuardia or JFK or LAX. We expect them to be open. But if you actually look, and I'm looking at a flight plan route now that would go into Martha's Vineyard, you approach from the west. The runway you would have been landing on last night is 24. That's heading to the southwest. What that means, Brian, is that as you approach this airport, you would have to go up and make roughly a 270-degree turn around onto final. Now, I had to do the same thing coming into Nantucket last night, which is that same runway that is 240, a southwest runway. And in that turn, I noticed in that sort of very inky blackness that I really had to catch myself not to gain or lose too much altitude or to get into an unusual situation. Now, as Bob Hager always points out in these situations, later you find out what the real situation is, and it's not necessarily what it seems in the first few moments. But let's just look at contributing factors here. You have weather that could be as bad as instrument conditions. You have someone who had excellent flight training, flight safety, one of the best schools there is in the world, but probably without a great deal of instrument experience. You have a new airplane, something he's had for 2 weeks, and you don't have a co-pilot, and you have an injured leg. Not to say that any of those caused the crash, but each one of those a potential contributing factor.
I know that some single-engine aircraft, to mention one brand, a Moody, can go up to $250,000, $300,000. What's the price for a brand new Piper of this model?
These are usually not that expensive. I don't know the exact price. Usually single-engine airplanes could, well, actually, let me catch myself there, Brian. You could spend $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, say, for a brand new top-of-the-line, say, Bonanza single-engine airplane. Saratoga is slightly below that, but I put that certainly in the six figures in terms of cost. But what happens, Brian, is that, when you start out flying, you have fixed gear, meaning you don't have to put the gear up and down. And it also gives you much more stability. It makes it much more sort of docile in the air. It's a slower, more forgiving airplane. When you make the step up to a retractable gear airplane, we can pull the gear up, it makes it what we call more slippery, less easy to control. It's faster through the air. And then this variable pitch prop means that not only do you have to control power, but like being in a car with manual gear, you sort of have to shift gears. So it adds to the complexity of an airplane. And I know that when I first transitioned from a training airplane into one of these, that I found it slippery and that you could, quite easily gain or lose more altitude than you wanted to and make more or less of a turn than you had actually planned to do. So it certainly adds as a contributing factor.
Judging from time basis, since he first had his permit and was flying, Cessna 172s that you mentioned with the overwing and the gear out all the time, is this quick to move up to a powerful single?
Well, there's a big concern that a lot of, successful young men, who have a pretty good income can step up to an airplane that is a little over their head. Now, JFK did train down at Flight Safety. It's an excellent school. He's been a cautious, excellent flyer. But sure, I mean, it's considered a real step up. Not unreasonable to take it this time. That is after 100 hours or so of flight, not unreasonable. But I think the real sort of trap here is that a call to Flight Service last night would have told you that there were no adverse conditions at all. And yet when you found yourself coming into the Martha's Vineyard or the Nantucket Airport last night and making a 270-degree turn to basically come from your course out of New Jersey all the way around to this airport that's almost the opposite direction, I found it pretty difficult to make that turn. I mean, I was losing and gaining a little more altitude than I wanted to, and I really had to stick with my controls rather than looking out the window. And I can certainly imagine how one could possibly run into trouble in a situation like that.
And I need your expertise one more time. For viewers just joining us, we have a plane missing, we believe owned by John F. Kennedy Jr., carrying John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife and sister-in-law are, we believe, the three passengers on this plane. Earlier reports that there was a flight instructor on to perhaps assist the new pilot, John F. Kennedy Jr., may very well be wrong. Leaving the Caldwell, New Jersey, Essex County area, 8:45 p.m. on a Friday night. A Friday night in summer in New York, a sweltering day here, might get over 100 in the city of New York, where you could almost, as they say, see the air. It was dank, it was heavy. Helicopter pilots, for example, find they get less lift in that kind of air. You feel like you can slice it. The aircraft is missing, remains missing. Officials and rescuers are chasing down various reports, looking for beacon sensors that might be in the water that might give off their location. And we're joined by, among other people, NBC News Chief Medical Correspondent Bob Arnott, who not only is an experienced pilot, made this run last night just to the island of Nantucket, one of the sister destination islands to Martha's Vineyard. And Bob, talk about there's haze in so many areas of the country. There's San Francisco fog. There's what comes on shore in Seattle that defies description. But this is this kind of New England haze that's a step away from fog, but can be very disorienting.
Well, last night, leaving from the Caldwell Airport, you would have to fly at about, say 1,000 feet or so until you were out underneath what we call the terminal control area. It was fairly choppy last night, pretty bumpy. You'd make your way about 20 miles to the east of LaGuardia and then beginning to climb. And as you point out, there's not much lift with this kind of heavy, hot air. This particular airplane is climbing at maybe 600 feet a minute or so. The recommended cruise altitude for the Saratoga is about 8,000 feet. When you're flying eastbound, you have to fly at an odd altitude, say 7,000 feet, plus 500 feet for visual flight rules. So you would imagine you'd be flying 7,500 or 9,500 feet. Now, ordinarily in many parts of the country, you want to get what's called flight following. As soon as you are over water in a single-engine airplane, you have a condition called automatic overwater engine rough, which means that you start to hear things happening to the airplane. It certainly gets your attention, and you usually tune into one of the frequencies. And it sounds like, from one of the unconfirmed reports, that he in fact was talking to one of these approach frequencies over the water. Now, if you're on an instrument flight plan, you will have a code that you're squawking, say 1356, and they'll see that trace on the radar. However, if your visual flight rules, as he was last night, is one code fits all, 1,200, and there could have been 5 or 10 or 100 planes out there, all with the same code, hard to distinguish one from the other. They would have that on radar and would make it easier for them if in fact they're talking to them. They'd have that on the tower tape, they'd have an approach control tape, and they also would be able to look at the actual radar trace to see if in fact this plane did disappear. You would call the Martha's Vineyard Tower, and you'd say, this is, say, November 333 X-ray X-ray, I'm 20 miles to the west of Martha's Vineyard, and then they would give you instructions. They'd say, fly course heading 060. They probably made him go a little bit further to the left of his course than he would have. And then he would have been responsible for making the turn back around onto the final approach course. Now, that frequency for the tower there is 121.4, so he would have had to switch frequencies there. He would have been pretty busy in the cockpit, and he would have had some difficulty in actually seeing the airport. And making that transition from being inside the cockpit of the airplane, relying on your instruments and your global positioning satellite system, which is what I'm sure he was using to navigate by, to outside and looking out and seeing, where's the island, where's the airport? And last night he would have been looking out and saying, well, gee, I can't see the airport, and maybe I see some lights. And it's quite difficult, even for very experienced pilots, the most experienced pilots or fighter pilots, to basically become quite disoriented as they go from inside the airplane, looking at their flight instruments, to outside, looking out for visual markings such as a runway or lights. And when he looked out last night, he'd have a very difficult time seeing much of anything.
Now, we're watching some of the pictures and from the aerial cameras, and Bob Arnott, if they have to now turn around a search, which we've been led to believe hours ago was 1,200 square miles of water, and as you know, water looks like water out there, and move it up north. Let's assume that something perhaps went wrong on approach to Martha's Vineyard. That's a long hike.
It's a long hike, Brian, and there are several famous cases of airplanes that have gone down between the end of Long Island and these islands out here. Famous helicopter crash, several small airplane crashes, and it can take a very long time to locate them. It's a big ocean out there, and these are very small ELTs. They're of course, vulnerable. The reason that the emergency locator transmitter goes off, of course, is that you do hit with a certain impact. Of course, you'd be looking for some debris, but these airplanes, with the low wind, which this has, if you hit at a fairly steep angle, a lot of the airplane is destroyed, and you wouldn't expect to find much of it around. It's not like a commercial airliner like 800 that went down to the day, as you were saying 3 years ago, where you're going to find a great deal of debris. With the wind that I'm looking at out the window out here and some small white caps, you can imagine that that would scatter pretty quickly. Also, many pilots don't carry either life vests or life rafts on these smaller airplanes, considering they're just over the ocean for a little bit. But when you get into a situation approaching an airport like this, and a steep turnaround to final, you often correct with your rudders, and with the foot injury that he had, of course, that's another potential complicating factor. So all in all, a tough situation for any pilot, even an experienced pilot, not to have a little difficulty last night. Add on to that a brand new airplane of greater complexity and speed, more slippery than the training airplanes he had, and these all could be contributing factors.
Bob Arnott, who joins us from Nantucket, but very familiar with the air route into and around Martha's Vineyard.
And I would assume he did, because you can get a GPS. That's a global positioning satellite system, a little handheld.
It helps tell you where you are exactly.
Yes, exactly, and it's a fabulous development. Many private pilots carry these in the airplane, even though you are not certified to fly instruments with them. It tells you exactly where you are. He could have easily used one of those to go directly from someplace around the north shore of Long Island to Martha's Vineyard, and he would have been over water for quite a while. That's not the best thing for a private pilot to do at night in a single-engine airplane.
And we are told now, John, that the Coast Guard is focusing its search for the plane carrying John Kennedy Jr. and his wife and her sister on that area off Martha's Vineyard. So clearly they believe that if something did go wrong, it went wrong in that area.
I think that
not an ideal situation, as you've just pointed out.
No, it's not. It certainly is not, and especially because of the night aspect of it and a water landing, if that's what happened. Now, one of the things to look at, of course, is fuel starvation. That can occur just because you don't get the tank switched properly. There are many, many different things that can lend to an emergency at night in a single-engine airplane, other than just having the engine break, so to speak, and stop. And by the way, just to give you an idea of how rare an occurrence that is, most people have never had the occurrence of having the engine on their car stop right in the middle of going down the freeway at 50 or 60 miles an hour.
Right, an unusual
airplane
situation.
That's right. Airplane engines are much better.
John, we were just talking about the fact that this plane had been upgraded, the cockpit, to make it more pilot-friendly, make it easier. Talk a little bit about how sophisticated an airplane, the interior is of this airplane.
Well, the thrust of most of the general aviation manufacturers is to try to simplify and give a lot of power to the pilot to get the information he or she needs by that simplification. In other words, you don't want just an on-off switch. Flying is still complicated, but what you do want is to make it very easy for the pilot to extract information that he or she needs, and we've learned to do this in commercial aviation and military aviation by grouping our instruments. I won't go into all the esoteric details, but all those lessons have been incorporated in this type of airplane. It is very easy to read the instruments on this panel. It's very easy to set them up, to set up the radios.
In fact, John, we're looking at a mock-up of, or a picture, I can't tell if it's computer-generated, of the cockpit and the interior of it. It does look quite complicated and a bit sophisticated. Is that?
Well, as a matter of fact, as you hold that picture there, now see you've got two yokes, one on the left and one on the right.
Right.
Both of them have instrument groups in front of them. Let's look over to the right for a second.
Okay.
You see 6 instruments, 6 round instruments. The one in the top row in the middle is called an ADI. That's an attitude deviation indicator. You look at that and it basically forms the same function as looking at the horizon outside the airplane. So you can fly on instruments that way, even if you're not instrument trained, if you get into trouble. And if you end up with an engine failure at night, you're still going to have battery lights and can still fly at that instrument. On the left, you have the airspeed indicator. That's the upper left dial. The upper right one is going to be your altimeter. And the one right in the middle on the second row, in other words, one row down, is your horizontal situation indicator, which basically is kind of a moving, not really a moving map, but it gives you an orientation to the compass. Those two glowing tubes in the middle are electronics that probably include a GPS, and I'm not exactly sure everything I'm looking at here, but it is a very sophisticated state-of-the-art type of panel for a general aviation aircraft.
All right, John, stand by for just 1 second. I just need to update viewers who might be joining us right now expecting to see the British Open. We have breaking news this morning. John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and reportedly her sister Lauren, were taking off from an airplane, a small single-engine airplane, shortly after 8:30 last night from an airport in New Jersey bound for Martha's Vineyard. They never landed. Family members have reported them missing at this hour. The Coast Guard and the Air Force have a massive search underway. They are focusing their search, we are told, on an area near Martha's Vineyard in the water where there are reports of an emergency beacon. At this point, nothing has been found. There is no sign of wreckage. There is no sign of any people in the water, just an emergency beacon, and the fact that this plane has not landed. If you are tuning in to see the British Open, you can tune in on ESPN to watch that. In the meantime, we're continuing with our coverage here. The Kennedys, John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife, were bound to Martha's Vineyard and then on to Hyannisport, where they were going to attend the wedding of Rory Kennedy. That wedding has been indefinitely postponed right now. The Kennedy family, much of them already assembled for the wedding, is at the family compound in Hyannisport. They have already held a mass where they have prayed for the safety, we are told, of John Kennedy Jr. and his wife. At this point, they are anxiously awaiting any news, as are many others, for hopefully the safety of John Kennedy Jr. and his wife. Let's go back to you, John Nance. You're a pilot yourself. If you run into a problem with a plane like this, what's the first thing you need to do?
Maintain aircraft control, and that may sound trite, but you'd be surprised how many people have lost their lives because the first thing they did was lose control of the bird. If you lose your engine, the first thing you do is set up a glide, and I'm just assuming that an engine loss here. We don't know what he's facing or what he was facing, but you make sure that you keep your airspeed, because you're already in the air, you have a certain amount of energy, and you start looking for solutions. How high are you? How much time do you have before you're going to be on the surface? You start looking for fuel source, see if you can start the engine up again, and in the meantime, you have to maintain that airspeed and look for a place to land. And as I say, at night, and especially over water, this is a double-barrel problem that really doesn't have a solution if you can't get that engine running.
Okay, John Nance, can you stand by one quickly? I want to come back to you in just a minute, but we are told on the phone we have Greg Bonono, who was a pilot involved in the search effort. Greg, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, what can you tell me about how the search is going right now?
I can tell you that we left Iceland MacArthur Airport this morning at about 9 o'clock or so, and we checked South Shore areas off the South Shore of the island, and also the Manitowoc area, and then out to Martha's Vineyard.
And obviously, you have not seen anything yet?
No, we have not.
What have you been told about this emergency beacon, or have you been told anything about an area that you're focusing on?
We've been told that there was a signal received on the emergency locator transmitter, but we haven't received that signal ourselves yet.
So you would normally be hearing that signal as well?
If we were in the area, yes, we would.
Okay, but you've been flying in the air and in the area and have not heard that signal?
That's correct.
So where are the reports coming that, who has heard the signal, in essence?
I can't give you that information. I don't know exactly who's been told that.
Can you just tell me, like, technically, how is this search being conducted? How are you flying? What are you doing? And how long do you spend up in the air, that sort of thing?
We were about 2 hours this morning. We were attempting to approximate the route taken from, we were told, Colwell, New Jersey, to Martha's Vineyard, and it was a mid-Long Island Sound direct line routing, pretty much.
And so you were trying to basically fly the exact same route that he had flown. Are you aware of the exact route? Because we're not aware if he filed flight plans or not.
No, this is just an approximation.
And on the way, absolutely no sign of anything?
No.
How many other pilots do they have up in the air doing this kind of searching along with you?
We've heard several organizations on the radio. We've heard the Coast Guard, Nassau County's up, Civil Air Patrol is also up. So there are many organizations participating in this.
Given that, I'm curious as to, since you've just tried to sort of redo or approximate the flight route that he might have taken, how much of that flight is over water as opposed to land?
From what I've been told, most of it is over the Long Island Sound.
Most of it is over Long Island Sound.
Yes.
And the area near Martha's Vineyard, where they are now where we are told they are now focusing this search, is there any land nearby? Should a pilot run into trouble?
There are some small islands between Martha's Vineyard and the Connecticut shoreline, and also between Orient Point on Long Island and Martha's Vineyard. So there are some areas along that routing.
I'm just curious, Greg, how unusual is it for you not to be hearing this emergency beacon? Is that something you would fully expect to be hearing?
If the beacon is operational, we should hear it. I don't know how long the beacon would have been on, battery condition, for example, on the ELT, but if it was operational, we'd probably hear it.
We are told last night that visibility was about 4 to 5 miles, but it was very, very hazy, and obviously it was dark and over water. In those conditions, how difficult is it? I mean, obviously, if something goes wrong, it's how much more difficult does it make it, in essence?
I'm not aware of the exact conditions last night. It was very hazy this morning. If it was hazy last night with 4 to 5 miles visibility, it would be difficult at best, I think, to see over water areas.
Greg, can you explain why haze poses such a problem?
It reduces the visibility. It reduces your forward visibility, and depending on your altitude, could reduce downward visibility as well.
Okay, and Greg, what's next? Are you going to go back up and resume searching, or?
Yes, we're going to refuel, and we're going to head back toward Long Island and try to parallel this approximate route that he's taken from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard.
So once again, you will try and retrace the route?
Yes, that's right.
All right, Greg Bono, thanks you so much for joining us. Best of luck with that search.
Heavily Irish Catholic areas around Boston who call the Kennedys really family. WHDH in Boston is going wall-to-wall in their coverage, and reporter John Hall is the one talking right now. We're going to dip in and listen for a moment.
State Police is on standby here on the island as we all wait for word on John F. Kennedy Jr., Randy.
All right, Jonathan, hold on there for a minute. I am getting word that the Pentagon will be holding a 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. our time news conference on this matter. Obviously, a couple of branches of the U.S. military are involved, the Coast Guard, and initially the United States Air Force, so we'll be hearing from them in terms of their involvement and what they know. We do also know that the FAA has some information in terms of the final contact last night at 9:39 through the Martha's Vineyard Airport, and we'll be getting an update on all of this information this afternoon, throughout the course of the afternoon. Now, Jonathan, back to you. As you mentioned, so many people there do have a strong feeling for the Kennedy family. They've been residents there and visitors there for many, many years. And obviously this is all very stunning information for the people there.
It sure is. We've talked to some people on the ferry coming over here to Vineyard Haven, and they are absolutely stunned. This is a family that has dealt with so much tragedy, beginning with the death of Joseph Kennedy, In World War II, his sister Kik also died in a plane crash. And, of course, the assassinations of JFK, RFK, the death of Michael Kennedy in a skiing accident, the death of David Kennedy in a drug overdose. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and one has to wonder, when is this heartache going to end for the Kennedy family? And those are some of the sentiments that I'm hearing here on the Vineyard. And they do have a strong connection. I mean, it goes back to 1969 with Chappaquiddick, where Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge. I mean, it's a very, very strong connection to Martha's Vineyard and to Cape Cod.
Many people stirring about on this, no doubt still steamy there as well, right?
I'm sorry, Randy, I didn't catch that.
Many people milling about on this steamy Saturday morning?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is prime season for the Vineyard. There are loads of people here, and people just getting off the ferry, you know, coming over for a nice weekend, and now they're hearing this stunning news.
All right, Jonathan Hall will be checking with you a little bit later. Again, Coast Guard is centering their search just off of Martha's Vineyard, looking for the plane that carried the pilot John Kennedy and his wife and her sister. They were to land.
Because there are reports that an airplane, perhaps the one the Kennedys were in, was spotted as it disappeared from the radar scope in the area of Gay Head, I believe is how they refer to that region. And the aircraft was a single-engine aircraft. A PA-32R is more commonly known as a Piper Saratoga. It is considered to be a powerful aircraft, not your starting-out aircraft. It is a performance aircraft, single-engine, has a altitude ceiling of around 12,000 feet. You can see it's a six-cylinder, has a fairly good range. Again, as you look at the coastline here, weather conditions in the area, according to the Coast Guard, are said to be very good for a search. Winds, though, about 20 knots. They say if it gets to 25 knots, there could be some whitecaps, but generally it is clear. We also want to remind you that there will be a briefing by the U.S. Pentagon at 1 o'clock Eastern Time today as they update the search effort. The U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as members of the Civil Air Patrol, all coming together to take a look at what could be a relatively large area of the sea surface as well as land that the aircraft could possibly have landed, and make no bones about it. It is quite possible the plane could be down and everyone is all right. Nothing has been confirmed to the opposite of that. Let's bring in Carl. Rochelle, Carl, that is true that we cannot make any speculation that the worst has happened yet. There's still many of possibilities where it could be down safe.
Absolutely, Martin. And I know of occasions where aircraft have landed off course, had to depart course for some reason. Every pilot is taught that emergency procedures, if the weather goes down in front of you, if you believe that you have a problem, find a place, put the airplane on the ground, make sure that everyone is safe, and then deal with the situation accordingly. So he could have turned away from his primary course, which was to Martha's Vineyard. He could be landed somewhere near there. Apparently, from the reports, he was close to Martha's Vineyard when they had last contact with him. So, and of course, he could have made a landing at sea. The R in the PA-32R that you were describing, the R stands for retractable gear. Usually that's the place they put it in the nomenclature for the aircraft. And what that means to you if you're landing at sea is the wheels are now tucked up under the airplane, giving you a smooth surface to put it down on, which makes it quite much easier to land on water. If that is in fact what they had to do, then it would be if you had a fixed gear aircraft where you have 2 or 3 landing gear pieces sticking down to hit in the water and trip you. So it would be easier to land the aircraft on water. It probably would not stay afloat for a long period of time, but it could stay afloat for a substantial period of time. And remember, you described it as a powerful airplane. It is a powerful airplane, and it is a good cross-country cruise aircraft. It is fast, but it is also, in the overall scheme of things, small compared to all that water that is down there and compared to an airliner. So it's, I don't know the exact wingspan, but it's probably in the neighborhood of around 30 feet. Holds 6 passengers. So it's a tiny dot down on the water. It's very difficult to find. That is why Coast Guard officials were telling me they're using more than just looking for the emergency locator transmitter and more than just the eyeballs. They have devices that are used to locate magnetic anomalies, sort of like a detector that you sweep across the ground looking for coins, just a sophisticated model of that. There are also devices that look for heat signatures, infrared devices. So they're employing a number of devices. They're looking over a 5-state area, which could tell you that they think that they need to be sure that it didn't land somewhere on land, that it's not somewhere within that route of flight that they had laid down for it. But yes, you're absolutely right, Martin. Hope should never be given up in a situation like this. It may be that everyone is okay. This is one of those scenes and situations where only the final results will tell you what actually happened out there and whether everyone is safe or not.
One of the issues that has come up already and may be looked at even more is this issue of IFR and VFR. And if you could, as a pilot yourself, Carl, explain to us the significance and last night what conditions he would have been flying under.
He would have been flying under, he could have taken his choice. Now, to tell you a little bit more, I'm a pilot and also a flight instructor and also an instrument flight instructor. So on a night like that, you could take your choices. I would, personally, if I were flying at night, I would file IFR, but you have to be an instrument-rated pilot to do that. And my understanding is that he had a private pilot's license without an instrument rating, which means he could not file to fly on instruments, and he could not fly in actual instrument weather. But the weather last night was not instrument weather. It was there was a bit of haze, but as long as he had 3 miles of visibility and stayed pretty much clear of the clouds, there are some actual numbers in there, but as long as he stayed clear of the clouds and had 3 miles visibility, he was quite legal to fly VFR. And that simply means that he could see how to get where he was going, he could see the horizon, he could see his landmarks down on the ground below him, and he could see the see and be seen concept of avoiding any other aircraft that might be in the area where he was taking his flight. IFR is really not a factor in this, only in the sense that the weather was noted to be VFR, not IFR. If the weather had been instrument flight rules, or IMC, as some of the more sophisticated people call it, for instrument meteorological conditions, what that means is you do not have the visibility, you do not have the ceilings, and there's a very strong probability that you are going to be flying inside of a cloud. And without training in how to fly an aircraft on instruments, it's a very hazardous thing to do. You can lose control of the aircraft very quickly, and that's why it is prohibited. So to have flown under instrument flight rules, he would have had to have A, been qualified, and B, the airplane would have had to have been qualified, and he would have had to. Flight plans are mandatory when you fly under instrument flight rules. So he would have had to file a flight plan, and there would have been one on the record showing his exact departure time and his route of flight and the checkpoints along the route of flight as he checked in and talked to the air traffic controllers, and he would have been on radar the entire time. Now, I understand that the aircraft was identified on radar, but unless you are in a terminal control area and have been assigned a radar, a transponder squawk. Now here I'll throw another factor in here that and I'll try to explain that. Transponder is a device that is on board an aircraft that is interrogated by the radar signal. As the radar signal hits the aircraft, it interrogates the airplane and says, who are you, what are you, where are you, and what's your altitude. Under VFR rules, the airplane sends back a 1200 code, 1200. That's what you have set in the window of the transponder. And it says, I'm a VFR aircraft, and it has altitude readout, so the transponder will tell the radar controller what your altitude is. And beyond that, there is nothing on there. Very often flying under instrument flight rules, the controllers will tell me that I have an unidentified aircraft at such and such an altitude and flying in such and such a direction, and you should keep your eyes out for that, because even though you fly under instrument flight rules, you're not always in the cloud. You can do it on a VFR day, it's fine, it's good practice. So the transponder would have been in there and would have been squawking 1200, and that would have shown a VFR aircraft flying in that vicinity. It would not have shown an IFR aircraft. But beyond that, the IFR is not a significant factor because the weather was not instrument flight weather. It was VFR, and he was flying VFR, which does not require the filing of a flight plan. It's good practice. It's recommended that you file a VFR flight plan with estimates on your actual departure time, and if he had done that, you would have known the actual departure time, because when he took off, he would have had to open the flight plan from the aircraft. He'd have had to call the controllers and say, this is aircraft such and such with a tail number. Would you open my flight plan to Martha's Vineyard? And you would have had an exact time of takeoff and a time of arrival. And when he didn't show up at Martha's Vineyard within those time parameters, within a half hour to an hour when he was supposed to be there, the FAA would have initiated a search on their own, Martin.
Carl, let me interrupt you for a moment as we swing over to Orland, Sydney, to get her information regarding the weather situation, both last night and today. Particularly of interest, Orland, is this question that some have brought up, the issue of haze.
Well, as you can see, this picture that we're looking at right now that we just saw, that was a hazy picture. That gives you an idea of what we're talking about. It's kind of, imagine light fog, and I use that really loosely. It's just a little bit of visibility obstruction. It can obstruct your visibility very greatly, down to 4 miles we have seen, but again, as Carl Rochelle pointed out, not down to the instrument levels. So that area we're certainly concerned with as far as the haze. This is another factor that we have thought up here in the Weather Center. We're kind of beating our brains out to figure out what could be going on. Notice that the sunset time for yesterday was pretty much close to what it is today. 8:26 for Caldwell, 8:13 for Martha's Vineyard. When you get close to sunset in the twilight time, the haze can become worse. You can actually see less visibility in those areas. So depending upon the flight time, whether or not he was flying in the daylight, that might have affected visibilities as well. Martin?
Orland, thank you very much. Recapping for you now, an intensive air and sea search is underway for the private plane piloted, it's believed, by John F. Kennedy Jr. On board with him is thought to have been his wife and one other person. The plane is overdue, disappeared last night. It was expected in Martha's Vineyard around 10 o'clock. It did not show up, and a search is underway along the Massachusetts and New York coastline. There is no confirmation beyond the fact that the plane is simply overdue.
Now that the events of that day, as reported by the news media, have been refreshed in your memory, watch the other videos that are linked in the description and watch them in turn. Do it immediately, as I believe from all the evidence I've seen over the years that this knowledge will mitigate the shock of what we are about to see unfold. In videos all across this platform and on the Chan boards, it is alleged, it is purported, postulated, and speculated that Q is in reality JFK Jr. The evidence is overwhelming, and the speculations fit the pattern of facts. As unbelievable as it sounds, since the frazzled rat is most likely involved, nothing is impossible. Send this video to your friends. Then, after the reveal, you can text them and say, "I told you so." Please subscribe to our backup channels, Whirlwind Revolt, Inglorious Patriots, and Net4Truth USA 2 Patriot channel. You can also find us at Net4Truth USA on BitChute. We fly so close to the target, we're on our 4th fighter jet. We will be relentless truth seekers until the enemies of freedom are defeated. You can support this channel by using the links in the description, but for a $100 donation, I will personally send you a autographed hardcover special edition copy of Land of Childhood's Fears. Also, visit my bookstore at lulu.com/Net4Truth USA. If you are viewing this video on BitChute, you can use the links in the description to support us, or simply click the green $ dot on our video to support this channel. Thank you. Links are in the description section.